especially the Smritis, because they are committed from memory. They are what was, but of course, Vivekananda and many thinkers and acharyas have said that you can build newer Smritis as times go ahead. The Shrutis are your basic foundational texts. So when you maintain your base and you move forward, this is again, in a way, a visualization of Indic modernity. Welcome, everyone. I before I start my talk, I wanted to share a small clip. Uh, that was just a small clip of AI based art, uh, of how, because AI is now becoming so popular, uh, of how art can be visualized in a modern way. So I wanted to kind of metaphorically start with that perspective. Thank you, Sangam Talks and Rahul Devan and Ojasvi, for giving me this opportunity. Uh, this is a very important topic, uh, something that needs a lot of discussion and consideration, and it's my small contribution to bring this discussion to the fore. And the good thing about modernity in the Indic sense is that it's very open ended and it's still evolving as we speak. So, let me start my talk with a presentation. I'll just share my screen again. Okay. So, Indic modernity, a civilizational vision of the future. Uh, what is modernity? I'm going to first define it in a generic sense, then look at what is the Western definition of modernity. As we all know, Western civilization has been quite dominant, especially because of colonialism and the way it has controlled global narratives to this day. And then I want to contrast this with an alternative vision of Indic modernity, because this is something, modernity has become so synonymous with Westernization that I believe that first it needs to be freed from that, so that we can also, as a civilization, continue to evolve as we always have. And in my argument is, it's not that we are creating something new. It's a part of the continual process of evolution of our civilization. So, in that sense, I'm not suggesting something new. I'm just taking it forward from where it has always been moving ahead. Modernity, as generally defined, signifies a historical and cultural epoch characterized by a significant departure from tradition, values, and practices, ref- uh, reflecting a profound transformation. Essentially, the areas in which it goes to in terms of transformation is societal, economic, political, and technological shifts. I would say more in terms of change. So it's society is moving, and these are different spheres of social thought, and all of those things are moving forward. This is what modernity is. The Western definition of modernity involves a decisive rupture from established norms, values, and practices. Again, it has, like I said, social, economic, intellectual, religious. The only thing about Western modernity is it's transformational in the sense that the past is gutted down and you're creating something new. And this was actually sparked by the destruction of feudalism, liberal democracy. And what happened is that in the process of creating something new, you wanted to destroy everything that was old. And I think in that process, and this was not something that happened overnight, it happened over a gradual process of 2 to 3 centuries. And at the end of it, we've reached a situation where Western civilization itself is in trouble. And which is why we as Indians and many Asians as well uh, are very nervous by modernity, because we feel that it will lead to complete erosion of our socio-cultural values. So Western modernity largely had three phases. Early modernity was from 1500 to 1789. It was marked and heralded by the invention of printing press. It included the periods of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Age of Enlightenment. So the Renaissance was looking at pagan, values and how it can be revived, and in certain sense, it was secularized. So the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle and the Greco-Roman thinkers came, but it came in very indigested forms, as Rajiv Malhotra would put it. From there, we move to the Protestant Reformation, Scientific Revolution, and the Age of Enlightenment. Now, here, if you would notice, the most important thing was scientific thinkers were always running counter to the religious orthodoxy, the Christian religious orthodoxy. And science and religion were always kind of seen as enemies of each other. Like religion is irrational, it's superstitious, and it is antithetical to the views of science. And Indians, Hindus, Dharmics would find this uh, something that they are not used to, because we have always had a tradition where these things are so closely interlinked. The religion, and that's why the way we look at secularism is, in the West, and we see a lot of problems and we do criticize it, and rightfully so, because for us, the religious aspect is so melded together with what people would call the secular sciences. How would you actually remove or divorce Aryabhatta, because his theorems and his mathematical explanations were in the form of poetic shlokas. And even if you look at Bharat Muni, who wrote the Natya Shastra, he did not really see it as only a treatise of drama and dance. He saw it as a way to explain and express his spirituality and the religious thought through those mediums. So we don't really have those clear separations in the way that they did. Classical modernity would be from 1789 to 1900s, to the early 20th century. The coming of the Industrial Revolution in England, in France, in Germany, especially. Uh, Newspapers, telegraphs, then, where communication was established, faster means of communication, of course, not as fast as we have today, but still people were starting to get interlinked. And then late modernity starts with the age of globalization, the two world wars, the fact that there were world wars itself. Before that, you would think of wars as regional wars, but the whole world in some ways gets involved, where you're talking about a globalization and modern life. Now, this again, certain thinkers would say the late modernity ends with World War II and post modernity starts from the 60s. But broadly, the fall of the Soviet Union in some ways is considered as, you know, the fall of late modernity. So, this is how it's broadly defined. Next, we move to principles of Western modernity. Yeah. So, if you look at it, these are the pillars of it: rationality and reason, individualism to the extent that it is hyper individualistic today. Individual freedoms are important, but there are no checks and balances of those freedoms. Secularism, separating religion, church, so segregating those things. And it starts from the French Revolution itself. Scientific inquiry, technological advancements. And if you look at it, many of these pillars are interlinked. For example, individualism and market economy and capitalism, because you look at it from an individual enterprise kind of an end. If you notice in many of these things, there's a lot of talk about rights, even liberal democracy. So there is a lot of talk about rights, but there are no checks and balances to those rights. And there is no talk about duties, which is like a black spot or an empty space. Also, it's marked by rapid urbanization and industrialization, where the countryside starts to empty, and there is a creation of a new middle class in urban Europe. Emphasis on progress and innovation. So a lot of some of these ideas actually have merit, right? But a few ideas, obviously, you can criticize. Emphasis on progress and innovation. So they wanted to move forward, and all modernity actually spends a lot of time on how do we move forward, which is a good thing. And challenges to tradition. So there are certain aspects of the past that they felt, and they needed to change that. And the manner in which it was done, it's not the fact that there were challenges, but what the whole idea, the whole crux of this Western modernity was, how do you challenge tradition? And the answer to that was to completely disrupt and create something new. That's where the problem lies. I want to again share some interesting anecdotes from Japan. So it's a Twitter post by a friend of mine, Ajay, and it's a very interesting Twitter thread, because now Western modernity, I want to come to an example closer to home in Asia, to give an example as to how Asians think about modernity. And this will not be a huge departure from where the Indic modernity comes into place. So I'm giving some context here. So if you see here, Shintoism accepts sensual gratification. It encourages sacrificing comfort for hard work. Confucianism, which is a Chinese tradition, emphasizes on learning and group harmony. It's because people behaviorally adhere to these values, Japan has seamlessly imbibed modern tech with their age old traditions. So, here he talks about the Shinkansen culture, as some call it. The Japanese prioritize traditions over anything that threatens to make them obsolete. Uh, the Japanese have a tradition, and this is a very interesting example, which will explain how modernity is visualized by Asians. The Japanese have a traditional tiffin system called bento boxes, where home cooked meals are taken to work in little boxes. This tradition dates back to the 12th century, where men used to carry cooked and dried rice called hoshi-e to work. That's when the bento culture started. Now, the important thing to notice is, of course, this has started at some point. It wasn't there in Japan from ancient times. But having said that, when that starts, how do the Japanese think of it and evolve a way that is relevant for the modern world? So here is the picture. In the typical bento box, different portions of food are neatly packed in these thin corrugated paper cups. Example, the green corrugated cup containing the Pikachu rice. So this is a picture of how a Japanese meal looks like in these boxes. These are very delicate to handle since the cups are easily deformable due to their frustrum shape in which they are, as you can see in this picture, and tapering structure. It needs to be handled delicately while packing meals. Otherwise, food may spill out. And I think this issue is also there in a lot of Indian food, right? Because oil or something can drip out. This is also there in Japanese food. So here you see an example of a cup container filled with peanuts grasped by human hand with different fingers. So let me take this story ahead, and then you will realize where the context is coming from. Now, here comes the Shinkansen culture where you would want a robot pack your meals quickly and efficiently to save human effort. A product engineer would tell you to change these cute paper cups and substitute them for something more sturdy or do them away. So, in a very purely rational scientific sense, that's what a product engineer will tell you. Oh, this is all old. We should have new way of doing things. So we should create something new. This is what many modern day supermarket meals look like. Piece of cardboard that's easily handled by robotic arms. Just fill the space with food and pack this. So this is how a consumerist, capitalist, Western way of doing things would look. But the Japanese resist this culture. So look at this picture here. They design a whole new type of gripper robots for soft gripping, especially to pick these kinds of paper cups. So they develop a robot, as Japanese would do, because they are, their robotics industry is so advanced. So they use it as an opportunity to solve a problem scientifically while retaining their tradition. So he says he spoke to a professor who heads this lab in a Japanese university. He explains the process of food packaging initially, and they begin talking of how they invented these robots. And he asks him, why not simply change the packing material? And he replies, tradition, and that was that. This is how they wrote so there is a paper on which he's written this. So, and finally, and I'll share the references to this paper. He says they may go to work in a super fast bullet train, but the way they want their bento boxes untainted by modernization. And then he says this is how they maintain their tradition, but of course, in a contemporary world. So, this is just an example of how the Japanese, closer to home, visualize modernization or modernity. So, Indic modernity is a cultural and philosophical adaptation within India, marked by a process of incremental change rather than a radical break from its historical heritage. It involves the integration of traditional Indian thought and spiritual values with contemporary principles, reflecting a synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern progress. It is talking about progress, it is talking about moving forward, but it is not cutting its umbilical cord with the past. So, this sync between past, present, and future is this alternative narrative of Indic modernity. Uh, Indic modernity has these pillars: individuality within a collective framework, balancing individual freedom and expression with a sense of community and interconnectedness. That a human being is part of a larger whole, a larger society, nation, community, and the universe. And that is it's a very philosophically dharmic concept. So it is an individual as part of a larger whole, and many a times we see this in our dharmic philosophy, in Hindu philosophy, where that whole idea of individual ego should be we should transcend that. At the same time, I also feel that we ignore the importance given to the individual as well. For example, the concept of karma itself. You are judged for your actions based on what you've done in your past life and this life, is a very individualistic principle as well. So it is not that it is purely collective or purely individualistic. It is actually a syncing of both. Only when you give importance to yourself can you do justice to your family, society, community, nation, and dharma at large. While at the same time, you are also responsible to all of those group identities that you're part of. Spiritual inclusivity and diversity. I think this is something that every Hindu would know, that there are so many different ways in which we experience dharma, from from our like familial traditions to sampradayik traditions. It's so decentralized and it's so spiritually diverse. So it gives importance to that diversity. Sustainable and harmony with nature. This is very, very important. uh, I still remember when the the tiger in the Pench forest, was had passed away, and she was a very famous tiger. People had actually, it was like a ritual of sorts. People were putting flowers, and the way in which we respect animals, the forest, the ecology is so different, and that's something that is very, very naturally part of our thinking. And in no other culture would we see that kind of importance given to ecology. uh, I also think of it as, when you think of your life as something that you'll keep coming back because of rebirth, right? It's not just this life, it's not just this particular time and space, but a space where you will keep coming back. There are two aspects to it, where you will take newer births. Your soul is the same, but you will find other bodies. And the second is your respect to your ancestors and your coming generation as to what you leave behind as your heritage. If you think of yourself in that sense, you will not exploit the environment, because you are part of that unbroken chain. So you have respect for your past and for the future. So ecology automatically becomes a very central part of your thinking, versus where you think that only this one life is important, and then you go to a day of judgment and then you're done with it. So this is where that comes from: dharma, duty, and righteousness. So not just about rights, but also about balancing it with responsibilities and thinking about righteousness in action. Pursuit of knowledge, of course, this is a very important cog in our thinking. Next, we move to seva and selfless service. And this is something that I think has gotten lost in some ways, where doing community service for the betterment of humanity and the world, which our ancestors used to do a lot. It was a very integral part of temples itself, their, in terms of their outreach during the ancient times. For example, the very famous thing that people know about in Sikhism is langar. But we also have that tradition of Bhandara, especially in the Vaishno Devi temple, where the poor are served free food. Even ISKCON does this very well. So, because many of our temples are no more in the control of the community and it's in the control of the government, our the concept of seva in many sense has been lost, and the community responsibility associated with seva, that is something that needs to come back. Decentralized theology but centralized social mobilization. And let me explain this, because we are theologically very diverse, linguistic traditions, sampradayik traditions. However, modernity also demands scale. It also, there is certain incremental benefit. uh, it's there is a force multiplier in terms of having centralization of some kind. So what I am suggesting here is, while we have theological diversity and multiplicity, which is very integral to dharma, at the same time we have a parallel, not replacing the spiritual and religious diversity which is decentralized, but in conjunction with that, a centralizing identity and thinking as well as Sanatanis, where socio-cultural activities, which could be anything like a tree plantation drive, having hospitals, doing social entrepreneurship, any form of community building exercise, to be done in a centralized fashion. And what that does is that also develops a larger identity and a greater vision of what it constitutes to be Indic, dharmic, or a Hindu. And I use all of these very synonymously, because I don't even think those things can be separated. They are all so integrally connected to each other. Inner well being and mindfulness and harmony with nature, prioritizing. And this is where this very, very clearly differentiates from Western modernity. If you look in Western societies, family as a unit is breaking down, mental health is becoming a problem, only focus on money and prosperity has led to an emotional and psychological breakdown, and there is a disconnect from spiritual and any form of religious thinking. Everything is seen as dogma. So this is something that is prioritized: adaptability and continual learning. So how we keep adapting our traditions, keeping the very basic core values alive, but how do we still keep moving forward? And I give an example of temples and how the Cholas and the Pallavas built them. The Pallavas were predecessors to the later Cholas. Pallavas were in the 5th, 6th century. So and this is where I'm trying to kind of change the thinking that modernity is not something that we are starting something today. Whichever generation you are in, that from your frame of reference is modern, because you have ancestors from the past and you are in a time which is later than the past, which is the contemporary time, wherever you're standing chronologically. So if the Cholas saw the Pallavas as the classical period, they would have built and Pallavas built temples at Mahabalipuram. They would have built temples in the same way, thinking that Pallava period was the golden age. And sometimes we have that golden age syndrome, Sone ki chidiya, that there was a time where we were glorious. And now that is important, but it is also important to acknowledge that our romanticism can become an obsession, that period to come back alive, rather than creating a golden age in the here and now. So there is a value to the concept of a golden age, to see the past, but as an inspiration for the present and the future. So the Cholas did not, when they built the temples of Tanjore, right, the Brihadishwara temple, they saw that as a continuation of what the Pallavas had built, but they also moved that architecture forward. So there you see that clear movement in terms of how they have cut the stone and how they have built that temple. But of course, there is link and inspiration to the past. So from that point of view, the Cholas for their period were modern in an Indic sense. So that is how I visualize Indic modernity. Uh, Principle, the other thing is culture preservation. You're preserving, which is very essential to what you have developed in the past, and also fostering creativity and innovation. The other important cog of Indic modernity, which I think uh, needs to be explored, and I see a lot of potential in this, is global engagement with local roots. And let me explain uh, what I mean by this. Uh, Hinduism is the longest surviving ancient polytheistic indigenous tradition in the world, which is unbroken. Uh, but there are also other indigenous traditions, some of which have been broken but are trying to revive themselves. Look at global polytheist, pagan, animistic, shamanistic, tribal, indigenous, ethno religions. Basically, everything that was rooted in a specific land, which had a specific history. And I think we as Hindus, as dharmics, uh, because we have been centered a lot around India and Indian civilization, both in the past and in the present, uh, we've also faced the issue of being a global minority. And because of that, we have lost global narratives. But I think there is an opportunity, and also, in my view, a historical responsibility to other indigenous traditions elsewhere in the world which faced challenges due to monotheism and colonization. And because we bring a certain authenticity and, quite honestly, survival instincts, because we faced all those challenges and survived and lived to tell the tale, we have a certain responsibility as well as an example that they can emulate, not in terms of tampering their traditions, but a historical example through which they can use for themselves to survive as a motivation and as an inspiration. And we can help them survive and evolve as well for modern times because they also need that. So, this is something which I think has not been explored enough. And I'll just give you an example. Uh, in Canada, right? Because we've seen the situation recently, what has happened in Canada. A few years ago, there was an example of Inuit people looking back at the history where they were put into mission schools, in hostels where their children, firstly, they were put into reservations and then their children were separated from their tribal communities and put into mission schools forcibly without consent. And then they found mass graves of Inuit tribal children from the past. And the Inuits had a huge protest, which happened there. And then the Canadian government apologized to the Inuit community. In my view, issues like these should interest us as well, where we raise these issues in multilateral forums. Firstly, because it's a responsibility as a polytheist tradition towards other polytheist traditions as well. Also, it helps in building our own authenticity because we have survived, and it also builds a global line of thinking. And I think that is where we need to. Indic modernity is now us moving from the seas, which Savarkar talks about, shunning the idea that we can't cross the seas, which, to be very honest, historically is untrue as well, because we did go to Southeast Asia, we did go westward as well. So our philosophy traveled. So obviously our ancestors traveled outside. So looking at the global world and our place in the global community as well. And that is also part of one of our all communal identities. Now, the next thing I'm talking about is why the need for Indic modernity. And I want to explain this in terms of the conception of time. This is a picture of the past, present, and future. And if you see, we've always spoken about how the Western time is defined by linear time, and our time is cyclical, in a circular fashion. But it's also, I want you to visualize this in two ways. One is that this circle is moving on a straight line. So I don't think the visualization of time is just cyclical, which is what many people say, but I would challenge that. Simply because if you look at many traditional texts, there is a clear understanding of genealogy as well. They do talk about genealogical history of kings, of different rishis. And even today, in many temples of India, many families actually can go back and see traditional documents. There are communities around temples who still maintain records of, who is your great grandfather, right up to 15, 18, 20 generations as well sometimes. And there has always been that respect to your ancestors, which has been very important. So, how would you say that it is strictly cyclical? So, I would visualize our thinking of time in terms of this circle moving in a straight line. So, there is a cyclicity of time, that different yugas are coming, but we are still moving ahead in linear time. And also, if you see this circle, it is constituted of many small straight lines. So it's actually an interplay of linear and cyclical time. So the way I would describe this in one line is, history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. So it does not repeat itself strictly in the same sense that it happened in the past, but you see certain patterns that keep coming back, which means that there is a cyclicity, but you're also moving linear, straight ahead. So, this I say from the point of view of modernity, why it is relevant is that this is a challenge that our ancestors also navigated. What we think of today as tradition, at some point in time, was modern. And they may not have used the word modern, but think of it from a conceptual sense. They would have had those challenges of their times. Initially we had Vedic fire altars, then we moved to wooden temples for which we don't find artifacts today. Then we moved to stone temples, right? So our tradition may have been the same, but the way we visualized those traditions kept moving forward. So that is what I wanted to kind of drive home here. Uh, so yeah, so that is one, and I gave you the example of the Cholas and the Pallavas. So the other thing is there is an importance given in our tradition to lived experience, and this is important from the point of view of modernity because you don't get wedded to a certain scripture in a certain way, especially the Smritis, because they are committed from memory. They are what was. But of course, Vivekananda and many thinkers and acharyas have said that you can build newer Smritis as times go ahead. The Shrutis are your basic foundational texts. So when you maintain your base and you move forward, this is again, in a way, a visualization of Indic modernity. So if you look at Indic traditions, especially monotheistic traditions, I won't necessarily say just Western traditions because Greek pagan and Roman pagan traditions are actually, in that sense, much closer to the way Indic traditions are, in the sense that they also don't give that importance to revelation. So monotheistic Abrahamic traditions give importance to a revelation, that there is a prophet or a sage who goes through a feeling of catharsis and he sees a god who reveals everything to him verbatim. And then you chronicle that in scripture. Versus Indic traditions, which look at lived experience, the sadhana, where a rishi goes through a certain spiritual transformation, of his consciousness. He goes into a forest, does meditation, and then when that experience is over, then comes the scripture or the thought. No one was sitting in one place and writing something down. It was an experience you had. And once that transformation was over, then the scripture kind of comes. So it is not textual, it is contextual, right? Which is why it also kind of links well. I mean, we never had that distinction of evolution versus creationism. We never saw evolution as a challenge to our religion. If you look at ISRO scientists when they launch satellites, you would see that they break coconuts and like they would do a small puja or something like that. And many journalists don't understand that, especially in the West, and I think even many Indian journalists as well. That how can someone believe in science and still think of tradition? Because we don't kind of divide those things, in such clear boxes. Those things are very closely linked to each other. But the other reason why there is a need for Indic modernity is because, and I'm sure many traditionalists also feel this, that uh, there is some crisis of cultural identity as well in India as well. In the newer generation, the Gen Z especially, there is a certain sense of cultural deracination, and that needs to be arrested, in my view. And sometimes that also happens because of certain rigidities that might exist, which which is a challenge that we need to address. So that, and the reason I say this is because what is the opportunity cost? If you, I know it's defined in an economic sense, but stay with me in this thought. Uh, the opportunity cost in the sense that there are some people who would not follow the tradition verbatim as is with all the strictures, but they would still want to be part of that culture. They would be interested in certain areas of philosophy. What do we do about them? Do we let those go because they cannot follow everything in the strictest sense? or do we still maintain a sense of cultural continuity with them? And I think that deracination has multiple reasons, one of which is that the joint family system itself has broken down in India. Because in the past, while the parents in the family could have been busy with work, whether it's at the farm or at the temple or whatever small trades they do, there would be grandparents, there would be uncles, aunts, there would be that ecosystem at home. We are not a missionary tradition which relies on a church to kind of keep the tradition alive. The family is actually a very integral part of that cultural and religious transmission. And now, because of the onset of the nuclear family, which, to be honest, is now becoming a reality, which cannot, in my view, be upturned. How do we deal with this challenge to avoid cultural deracination? And I think this should interest every dharmic person, because to lose that umbilical cord, to lose that chain of transmission, only when the family imparts those values to the next generation will you go to a sampradaya or a temple and maintain that continuity. If the family does not do its job or responsibility, then we cannot expect the government or some super nanny state to come and do the job. That's not how it happened in the past, and that's not going to be the way in which it's going to happen in the future. So that's an important challenge, which I believe Indic modernity can address, providing a more global and international outlook. Because from a civilizational perspective, that's one of the most important challenges and priorities that we need to deal with. uh, Respecting theological diversity, maintaining it, and also developing a common sense of Indic or Dharmic high culture. And I'll come to this as we go ahead. That every person can aspire to achieve. I've spoken about environment. The other thing is spiritual well being in the context of material challenges. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, right? So it's not that Artha is not important, it is. But how do we keep that spiritual balance? That's the challenge. And balancing materialism with inner fulfillment. So, all dharmic traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, they prescribe a certain life for the spiritually inclined, for someone who wants to go into the path of the Sangha, and someone who is a householder. They do have that. So it's not like, even in Mahabharata, Krishna does not, Arjuna wants to kind of give up the battle, and because he has his family on the other side, and just go and become a yogi or something like that. But he says, no, your responsibility is to fight, to be in this world, to do a worldly thing. And through your karma, you will still attain moksha. So we do give importance to the material world as well. So that adopting modern methods of practice, propagation, and enrichment, because this is very crucial and critical for the sustenance. Uh, Promoting common cultural identity via community outreach and community building activities. Looking at science and spirituality as parts of a larger whole than in counter to each other. And yeah, in the context of that, the clip that I shared in the beginning, it was about, uh, and it is not original to me. There are a lot of AI artists who have done a lot of, who basically use modern art but have shown Hindu deities and temples in different forms. And I found that quite interesting. Uh, so that is something that we should encourage even more. Bringing back the temple as a community building and a place for social activity by reviving traditional arts, crafts, martial arts, singing, dance, drama, etc., where a temple actually was a place where these things used to happen. Of course, a lot of this starts with one point, freeing those temples, because only then these things can happen and we can hold our destiny. But this is important. Like, if I give an example, I go to a Hindu temple, which is my family temple, where we go for the last 20 years. Till today, I have never met a single person outside, probably the temple priest in that temple. I don't know anybody else. My family goes there for over 20 years, but I have never met or formed any community association via that temple, because it's become such a individualistic experience, right? That the community feeling of experiencing that deity, of doing, like, of that spiritual feeling has completely been lost. And it's only the individual experience, and we are part of a larger whole. you know when would be the last time we would have formed a business network or even a community or a cultural network in our temple? And I'm not even talking about larger temples like Tirupati. You would accept that because you're going to that temple once in many years. But this is those small temples. I think we forget the fact that because dharma is decentralized, the the blood that flows in the vein of dharma is from those small temples in our neighborhood, not those big temples. Those big temples are important, but they are the once in a year or once in 10 years kind of an experience. It's the temples that you go every day, jahan mata tekte hain, or a temple that you pass by every day when you're going to work, and you just say a small shloka in front of that deity and just move ahead. That temple is actually more important. And preserving those temples, because they don't make enough money. The pujari can barely, feed his stomach or run the temple or get some agarbatti. They don't make any money. Reviving and sustaining those temples is actually at this point the number one priority for all. Only then will you have larger temples thrive, because these temples are the ones which you visit on a regular basis. And then building large institutions, educational and other institutions. And we have lacked that. We have lacked the, you know, you can put some of that blame that we don't control the temples. But in my view, even if the temples were to be free, there is no guarantee that we will be able to build large institutions at scale. We've not demonstrated that, apart from few exceptions. Those are exceptions, not the norm. So being, having that institutional framework, the modern world demands that. And I think that is the challenge that, yeah, I want to talk about different stages of Indic modernity. So one aspect is, of course, we establish our classical age as Vedas and how they transition into the Upanishadic phase. And then we move to the Puranic era. And now I want to, these are not compartments that are different from each other. These are all, like I said, incremental change with continuity. So the Puranic phase, and then the most important part of our modernity is the Bhakti movement, where you have devotionalism as the center of, you know, uh, uh, the spiritual practice. A lot of the texts were rendered in common languages, the Prakritic languages. There was a lot of chanting, there was a lot of satsang and kirtans, and there is a very interesting example that Meenakshi Jain actually gives, I think, in her book, The Flight of Idols, where she talks about the creation of satsangs and kirtans as a very, it wasn't there in ancient times. It was a form of evolution, of spiritual evolution of a society that was going through invasions and large scale iconoclasm. So, in a kirtan and a satsang, the concept is that a community comes together, congregates in circles or, in different ways, with someone who's leading it, and people are chanting, right? There is not necessarily an idol. People are just chanting. And the reason is the body itself is a Swayam Murti. It's a very Vedantic thought in practice, but it's a society which is, how do I put it? It's going through a form of therapy, because it's trying to evolve in a state where idols are getting destroyed, but people still want to maintain their tradition. So they come together in small communities and they start chanting and doing satsangs and kirtans, where the body is the Swayam Murti, you know. And she gives a very interesting example of a Devi who is talking. I think there is a shloka. Don't quote me exactly on it, but it's a shloka or a saying where she's talking to the sage, which is where the sage is saying that he is not able to build those grand temples of the past, in metal and in gold and all of that. And the Devi is telling the bhakta that, and I'm kind of summarizing this, that don't worry about how the idol is. Your feeling to your devotional feeling towards me is more important. So I understand that these times are difficult, but even if you're building a stone idol, or if you have the devotionalism in your heart, I would still be satisfied. And this is a metaphorical sense of how a society was evolving, you know based on the context of that time. It wasn't losing its connection to the past, but it was constantly evolving. In that sense, I would say Hindic modernity is actually traditional. I don't see it as a counter to tradition at all. It's a way to recontextualize tradition. That's how I would kind of word it. And then you look at, so the way you had earlier modernity, classical modernity, late modernity, I would put right up to the bhakti movement as the older version of modernity, classical modernity as these Arya Samaj, Ramakrishna mission, Brahmo Samaj, Chinmaya mission, ISKCON. A lot of these were actually created during colonial times, and I see each of the some of these, especially the bhakti movement and these, versions of modernity, especially in the 1900s, early 1900s, 1800s, as a way through which a society was trying to recontextualize and heal itself, because colonialism, both from Central Asia, the Turkic invasions, as well as the British colonialism, caused a great amount of upheaval in the religious and cultural sense as well. And it developed a huge sense of inferiority complex, which to some extent we haven't healed completely even today. And these were traditions like, for example, Arya Samaj, Brahmo Samaj. Sometimes they are trying to cope with what they are facing, the onslaught of westernization. And they are trying to recontextualize and yet not lose that connection to the past. And then you would look at a later stage of modernity, which is post independence, especially today. You have groups like Art of Living, you have Sadhguru's Isha Foundation, Shri Shri, and Shri M as well. Uh, these are also part of modernity, in the sense that a lot of youngsters who have uh, lost touch with the traditional Sampradayic paths or their familial traditions, a lot of young working professionals still continue to go to these places where they actually, a lot of these gurus have been able to recontextualize, philosophy, especially through the practice of yoga, meditation. And a lot of youngsters and have then been able to delve deeper into traditional thought as well. So the way I see it is that it is not in counter to the traditional sampradayas at all. It is actually, you can think of it as some of them will go into these new age traditions. And, I use that word new age in a way because people can kind of understand it. I don't want to call that new age. It's just that these are modern, like, day creations. They were not there in the past, but many of them, of course, continue the practices as well. So they go into these new age traditions and they develop a sense of community. If you go to a Satsang Foundation or Anisha, you actually know a lot of volunteers know each other. They know people who are kind of running, these community uh, seva programs that they do and all of that, the yoga meditation camps. and they get a genuine feeling of community. They also get a connect to the spiritual aspect of it, and then some of them actually take up deeper study as well. So in a way, you could say it's a funnel to bring them back in. So I wouldn't see tradition and modernity in that sense. And this is how Hinduism is, right? These things can't be separated. They are all very linked to each other. I have seen people who have no religious beliefs, but they will still do the ritual chanting of shloka because that's what their father taught them. In that sense, I would say Hinduism does not have an orthodoxy, it has an orthopraxy, because orthodoxy is about beliefs. Orthopraxy is about practices. The discipline of daily practice is actually more important. And the belief, while it is there, it is in some ways secondary. The lived experience. If you're practicing your daily, what you're supposed to do on a daily basis, that's more important than just pure belief. So, from that point of view, I would say that there is no orthodoxy. There is a traditional school of thought, but it would not be orthodox. It would be orthoprax. Yeah. So this is what I would see it as distinct phases, part of a larger whole. I want to contrast Indic modernity with Western modernity because it's very important to break the monopoly of modernity with Westernization. Those two things are not the same. And I want to bring that separation out. If you look at the philosophical found, so the first line of difference is change with continuity in the Indic sense and transformational change. The other aspect of it is Western modernity is influenced by Enlightenment. It emphasizes on reason, individualism, secularism. Indic modernity is rooted on Indic thought, inclusivity, harmony, nature. I've mentioned that. And view of the individual in Western modernity is based on individual rights. The individual is the central fulcrum, and everything else is secondary to the individual. Indic modernity is a balance of individuality in a collective framework. Both are important. I want to emphasize this. The collective is not more important than the individual. Both are equally important. And it sees individuals as a part of a larger whole. Spirituality and religion, it often, Western modernity looks at secularization, the separation of church and state. Indic modernity looks at diverse spiritual traditions. It looks at everything as being interconnected. Western modernity's approach to knowledge and science is based on empirical observation and scientific entity does give importance to empirical observation, but it also looks at inner wisdom and spiritual insight. It looks at patterns. It acknowledges the importance of intuition and experiential knowledge. I think one thinker that people should look into further on, who talks a lot on this subject, is Professor Gautam Desiraju. He talks about how intuition and experiential knowledge is important, and he's given an example of Maslow, who built the not Maslow, Mendeleev, who gave the periodic table. It's a very interesting example he gives, because Mendeleev actually was able to do that through intuition. Anyways, going ahead, view of nature. It Western modernity looks at this world as a way to just, it has a very utilitarian view of nature. Just exploit the resources, pursue scientific thought endlessly without any control, without looking at how we are polluting the environment, without looking at what are the ramifications to human society going forward, because your focus is just on the here and now. Indic modernity would look at scientific progress, yes, but it also looks at the sacredness of the natural world and how to maintain harmony with nature via sustainable practices. In terms of values and ethics, Western modernity prioritizes material success and individual rights. Indic modernity looks at compassion, spiritual growth, a sense of duty. Values ahimsa not of the endless kind, but Krishna's version of ahimsa. the non-aggression principle, that you look at not engaging in violence, but of course, as a sense of, if you have to retaliate in the advent of any aggression, of course you have to respond. And Mahabharata is the example of that. Approach to social justice, focusing on legal and political frameworks. Western modernity looks at oppressor, oppressed, social inequalities. It looks at welfare and affirmative action programs. Indic modernity looks at a more holistic approach, integrating spiritual and ethical values. And it also looks at selfless service, community empowerment, and it is open to welfare, but in the sense that how does that welfare lead to value creation? What can you give so that once you have done that charity, maybe that person can then do something to give back to society? How you can improve the lives of people. So I wouldn't just think of it as handouts. Uh, and then cultural diversity, which is acknowledging cultural diversity and promoting. Western modernity looks at it from the point of view of acknowledging that diversity, but it does not promote genuine inclusivity. It does not really different people from different cultures, but talking the same thing. They are not really, they look diverse, but their ideas are one. They are linear. Indic modernity actually looks at different ideas. You have this view of this Jain thought of Anekantvad, these seven blind men who are touching different parts of the elephant. There is one elephant, but they all experience that elephant in different ways. So they describe it in different ways. So there is an acknowledgement of that one truth, but there is space for people to experience and visualize it in different ways. And this is the part that is actually my recommendation for actionables. And this is the thing that I really, really am very passionate about, which is, firstly, I think there is a lot of genuine merit in sampradayas, and I think they have a key role to play in organizing society, because they are the last mile connectors in the religious sense. And I think they have a much bigger role to play in keeping society together, in keeping traditions alive. I think that the second point is dharmically run nanny services, sponsored and trained by temples, intuitive and not prescriptive imparting of values. So a nursery or a daycare, and because this is an acknowledgement of the challenge we face in the modern world, that nuclear families now are becoming increasingly the norm. And when they are becoming the norm, and when women are also going to the workplace, and rightfully so, when parents don't have time for their children, how do we maintain that connect with tradition? How do we keep dharmic literacy to the younger generation, to the newer generation, so that the chain doesn't get broken? And I think once temples are freed, uh, uh, dharmically trained nannies who are trained at the temple, and then through very, very non-invasive and through fun activities, in a very experiential form, they provide dharmic literacy. They teach shlokas. They teach the importance of family, of tradition. Uh, so yeah, it gives importance to the family, but it also there are two aspects to it. One is, of course, grandparents are an important part as well, but there is an acknowledgement that we will not have those large families going forward. And even if you see in terms of fertility rates, there are fewer and fewer children. You will almost see that except for 3 or 4 states now, all the other states in India have replacement or sub replacement level fertility rates. So it's a family of two or maybe one. And there is a problem of the missing grandparent. So that problem is solved by the arrival of a nanny. And that nanny is the one who provides the training, especially the foundational training at a younger age. And then you can have children going to Bal Vihar, like, Chinmaya Mission runs that, and maybe going there during holidays. You can conduct hikes to spiritual destinations. Travel and Tirth Yatra, combines and comes into one. So through these fun activities, I think there is an institution called Draupadi. I'm forgetting the name, Draupadi Institute or something like that. And I think one of the people there has spoken in Sangam Talks as well. I think they organize spiritual, like those trails in many of these places in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata itihasas. A lot of these historical places which exist even today. Uh, One very interesting place is actually the original Red Fort or the Lal Kot, which is not the Mughal Red Fort, which is basically a place called in Indraprasth, which was the ancient site of the Mahabharata. There is actually a place called Lal Kot, which was the original Red Fort. I mean, places like these which people don't know, and you build this whole spiritual religious experience in conjugation with activities that people are doing today. And a friend of mine gave me this example that you could have these infrared goggles. Uh, how do I say it? A lot of our historical sites have been demolished, and many of these places have broken down. The maintenance and preservation of them is a huge challenge, and we don't fully have that opportunity because Archaeological Survey of India is underfunded as well. That we can build everything back today. Many of those structures are demolished, and reviving or building them back is a huge process which will take many years. So what do you do? Let's say you go to a place like Hampi or certain places where things have been broken down. You can have infrared goggles through which you can actually revisualize and recontextualize how that place looked through a guided tour when it was there in its original form. And you can experience. This is a challenge we face because many of those ancient structures don't exist anymore. And you can revisualize them and still live them, and connect ourselves through the past, but using modern means. Mahabharata readings organized in cafes. Actually, this is being done. There is a group in Mumbai called Kasakai, where actually Mahabharata readings and tellings are organized in very chic and hip cafes where youngsters go. Average age of the people going there would be in their late teens and early 20s. So they have a cup of coffee, they are eating a sandwich, and they actually share. They are not so they do accept the fact, like they don't have experts talking about Mahabharata in the clear, very, very well defined sense that the Itihasas are, the Valmiki Ramayana or even the Mahabharata of Ved Vyas. But many of them talk about their family, tradition of what their grandmother told them. And through these, because our first story of the Mahabharata or the Ramayana that we hear is not the show that we watched or the book that we read. It is actually grandmother tales. And they share these stories with each other over a cup of coffee. And why should that not exist? Because there are these beautiful stories in our families that we get to share with each other. And through that, we kind of continue that process. We should not break the process of family tellings, even if those family structures of joint families don't exist. Through these processes, we can keep them robust and alive. So it's very interesting, and I would exhort a lot of people to actually, if they come to Mumbai, to go and visit these tellings. It's quite interesting. Fusion music of traditional forms with modern elements to render ancient shlokas. There are people who actually do that. There is a genre of Carnatic rock. There are Carnatic rock bands who actually use traditional instruments as well, but they also mix it with guitar, and they actually produce ancient shlokas from the Vedas, Sanskrit shlokas, through modern beats as well as through traditional instruments. They do a fusion of that. So there is a very good band called Agam, which I would exhort the viewers to check out. And they have some very interesting works that they've done. I also have a friend who does this called Omar Ghazi. He uses a lot of percussion instruments, and he uses a lot of shlokas written by Shankara to and renders them to the modern percussion beats. And it's quite interesting, actually. I also think that we need a center, and this has been repeated like a broken drum, that there has to be a private temple administration which gives importance to decentralized theology and religious and philosophical practice, but also it helps in building a centralizing narrative and a centralizing identity as well, because in the field of temple administration and in the field of community and social action. And let me give you an example. In the case of the Shabarimala issue, right? There was a lot of response at a local level, but I felt that the larger community outside of Pathanamthitta or Kerala, the larger Sanatani community also should have been bothered by it. So let's say, for an example, uh, the Kamakhya temple. It is a temple of Shakti as a menstruating goddess, right? It's the Shakti Pitha which were formed because different body parts of Sati fell in different parts of India, and that's how the Shakti Pithas were formed. Why should a person in Kamakhya temple not have also responded to that? Because they are also part of the shared Sanatani culture and experience. It is not just the people in that one place in Kerala, it's that larger identity as well, which is important. And in that sense, I feel while the theological and religious diversity should be decentralized and should continue in the same vein, a central identity should also be there. And there is benefits to scale, because smaller temples, and I'll give you another example. A larger temple. So let's say there is a Tirupati Balaji temple in Tirupati, but there are a lot of small replica Balaji temples in different parts of India and abroad, where people probably go in hundreds or a few thousands, but they go on a regular basis, they offer something. A larger temple and smaller temples are like, for the lack of a better word, feeder temples for the larger temples. If fewer and fewer people go to those smaller replica temples of Balaji or of Ganpati, right? Then that will also reduce the footfall of the larger temple, because devotionalism to Ganpati is being affected. So fewer people will then go to a Prabhadevi temple, which is the larger Ganpati Mandir. So a larger temple should have a responsibility, because it has the benefit of scale, it has the benefit of more money or a higher treasury value. So it has a responsibility on maintaining smaller temples, and smaller temples, because of their interconnectedness to a larger temple. When, let's say, a priest in a temple passes away and the next generation is not there to take it forward, right? The larger temple will help kind of sustain the smaller temple because of its scale. So there is an inherent benefit in the administrative aspect. Like, for example, why can't there be one ticketing app for all temples, right? There is a benefit to scale. That's not going to affect your spiritual practice of going to the temple, but it helps build scale. And you can kind of break this whole VIP culture that somebody will cut the line and go to a temple deity. Why would a temple deity show any favoritism, right? So you can have this whole VIP thing that is becoming very commercialized, where you pay higher money. Everybody goes through the same line, and you have an app. You book a particular time, and you go and visit the temple at that time. So so you can integrate modern technologies. I think there should be greater youth participation initiatives. Also, I had this vision, and there was a lot of AI art that I showed in the beginning. A blueprint of harness, because we don't see science and technology as counter to our tradition. So technological temples, like, for example, especially where technology is harnessing nature, like having a Surya Dev Mandir uh, in a solar plant, or having a Pavan Putra Hanuman temple in a wind farm. what greater respect would you not give to the deity when you use the energy that comes from the deity itself, right? And we need to visualize a lot of modern Hindu architecture as well. Uh, and I think I actually find the Aurobindo Ashram has, one of those very good examples which uses a lot of traditional as well as creates new modern architecture. And I think we need to build on that. We need to build a sense of new dharmic high culture in art, in singing, in dance, in theater, in drama. And of course, I showed those artificial intelligence art, newer forms of artworks. Uh, and I think this is something I think Swati Goel Sharma wrote an article on this, that Hindi cinema, Bollywood, and even regional cinema lacks a genre of the Diwali film, in the sense that there is a Diwali movie that releases on the week or day of Diwali and it's gets huge box office. But are those movies around the festival of Diwali? Like the way there is a genre of Christmas movies? There isn't. And I think that is an area that should be looked at in terms of how, families today, how do they celebrate Diwali? And I think that would be a great way. In fact, movies around different festivals, because it's a great way to counter social activism, of the negative kind, which is always which always Hindu festivals have to face. What water wastage during Holi, fireworks and air pollution during Diwali. I mean, those kind of things. I think this would be a great positive way to kind of foster greater conversation in families, with movies, small documentaries as well, which talk about the festival. And yeah, I was thinking, how about having a selfie movement of taking selfies with your Kul Devta? People, because a lot of the familial deities or village Gram Devtas, they are losing, because a lot of the bigger deities have, of course, they are very important, but a lot of local deities and local traditions are being forgotten. Many people, you would be surprised to know how many youngsters don't know who their Kul Devta or Gram Devta is. And that's a very problematic thing. So, ways through which these things can be made cooler and people can, dharmic literacy improves. I had a few other things as well. Promotion of Sattvic food, development of Sattvic cafes and eateries, linking of orphanage homes and old age senior communities. I think this is a very, very synergistic thing, that kids, for whatever unfortunate reasons, who don't have parents, and senior communities, because they don't have, for whatever reasons, their children, many of them, of course, are volunteer senior communities as well. These seniors and the orphanages could actually link with each other, and they could also kind of form a sense of community for these children. And I think work around orphanages is something that I think more dharmic communities need to do. It's important, and I think there are a lot of families where there are no children, and people at a later stage in life decide to adopt children, and I think that option should be available. Temple run schools and temple based community networks, which I've spoken about before in detail. There should be structured workshops with play and fun like Bal Vihar. There are dharmic literacy apps, but a few apps actually, the UI experience is not that great. But I think a lot more work needs to be done on that. Uh, Doing crossword puzzles, other games around the Hindu universe, very digestible content. Culture designs is something which is doing a very good job in this field, and I think more people need to work on this. There's a certain sense of technology that has come in our practices. For example, digital hundis, electronic and digital pujas, especially during COVID. Like a lot of live streaming and live pujas, homams were happening, and people were actually seeing these live because they could not go to temples. And I think we should use this as an opportunity to expand this even further, even for those people who cannot, for some reason, go to these temples. That access should be available. And this is again in continuation of how we developed home temples when the larger temples were going through uh, a sense of there was a sense of destruction happening, and for whatever reasons, small, like, we were not able to access them because many of them were getting demolished. We started evolving and building smaller temples in around our communities or village, as well as in our homes. In that sense, the digital technology should be our ally in kind of taking this further, to the next generation. Reviving lost schools of thought, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Samkhya. I think those are also aspects that there should be more discussions, study groups on Hindu philosophy as well. Uh, Temple education, of course, I think it's not just freeing temples, but also creating an ecosystem of schools, which is very critical, so that when these children who have had dharmic literacy through Bal Vihar and through nannies, when they go to school, that has to further get reinforced. At every step, there is a link, there is a dharmic link, so that when that child reaches, when it goes of age at 18 or 20, when it goes to college, he or she is already spiritually, dharmically literate and is not deracinated at any step at that point. And of course, when you reach adulthood, you take that forward. There, then personal responsibility and initiative comes to the fore. And yeah, and to revive the idea of charity, punyakama, that aspect of it has been missing for a while. And I think, especially in summer holidays, children could be sent to not just spiritual uh, like basically yatras, but also they could work in community initiatives. And parents should, I think, encourage and foster that. Lastly, social entrepreneurship should be encouraged, and temples itself should fund social entrepreneurship programs once they get freed. Of course, all of this comes thereafter. Lastly, I want to talk about challenges for Indic modernity and way forward. And Abhinav Prakash actually talks about this in one of his articles, where he talks about there are three strands in the Indic movement, in the Indic Renaissance, which is one is the traditional strand, where there is a bunch of people who are deeply tied to the past and who want to bring back those values today because they feel that those are lost. Second is the conservative stream, where they have a link to the past, but they also see that past that needs to be reimagined in the present. And third is the modernist strand, which is, of course, understands the past, lives in the present, but is also trying to present a vision for the future. And I think these are not exclusive. These are all working in a team for the larger civilizational cause. Because we have seen the consequences of fragmentation, which I call here Panipatization. Because in the Battle of Panipat, the Sikhs, the Jats, the Peshwas, the Marathas, the Pahadis, they all had, at some point, they were not able to work together as a team. And they all had their own ways in which they branched out. And I think that is a civilizational wound from which we haven't recovered today. And we need to learn from that past and look at the benefits of mobilization at scale at a larger level. I think that the idea that you build an intra community consensus is very important. It's not anything goes. I want to clarify that. Modernity doesn't mean that you have anything goes. It is, you have a common set of non negotiable values. And from those, then you branch out in different ways for other aspects of it. And you accept limitations and create parallel systems, which is a certain centralizing system which works in tandem with the decentralized theology, philosophy, culture, religion. And you preserve both those identities together, not exclusive, but inclusive and melding together. I think it's very like Hinduism is a way of life. So it is an entire lifestyle. It is not just yoga. The problem is that we take these small parts and we forget the larger whole. And a lot of that happens because I think we ourselves, there are two aspects to it. We ourselves are not self confident in terms of who we are. Second, especially in the diaspora as well, those who go outside, we have a sense of we want to fit in there. So sometimes we ourselves reinforce and we talk about, okay, Gandhi, oh, we are the land of Gandhi, we are the land of yoga, and we don't go beyond that. So this superficiality needs to go, and we need to be confident of our way of life, and the entire lifestyle itself is what is our soft power. It is not just one or two aspects to it. So that is how I would see it. And if you do that, then this whole, and when he talks about this, I think he argues this very well in Cultural Digestion, where yoga is secularized and it is divorced from the philosophy and the spirituality and the religion. It is just seen as a bunch of exercises you do and asanas you do in a yoga studio and with a yoga mat. So instead of modifying that, you present the whole lifestyle in totality. That is what our soft power should be. Thank you.